Welcome to Family Betrayal Revenge. Stay tuned. Have a fun time and let's talk in the comment. Let's go!
The deadbolt slammed home at exactly 11:03 p.m. That was the only gift my stepmother gave me for my 18th birthday. Inside the warm house, my father watched through frosted glass, then turned his back. I stood on the porch as Minneapolis wind chill hit 30 below zero with nowhere to go. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm Sydney Carter, and I'm 18 years old. Or I was 18 years old for exactly 3 hours and 14 minutes before my stepmother Leslie decided that my legal adulthood meant I was no longer her problem, no longer entitled to the warmth of the house my grandfather had paid for, no longer deserving of even the basic human decency of shelter during a Minnesota blizzard, and the sound of that deadbolt, that metallic click that echoed through the frosted glass door, that sound wasn't just a lock turning, it was a door closing on 18 years of pretending we were a family, 18 years of me making myself smaller, quieter, more invisible, trying to earn love from a woman who saw me as competition, as a liability, as something to be managed until I could be discarded. And tonight, at exactly 11:03 p.m. on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which was also my birthday, which Leslie had always said was inconvenient, always said meant she had to choose between celebrating love and celebrating me, and she always chose love. Tonight she'd made her final choice, and I was standing on the porch with a backpack containing everything I owned, which wasn't much: some clothes, my grandfather's old watch, a photo of my mother who died when I was 6, and $152 in cash that I'd saved from babysitting jobs Leslie hadn't known about, hadn't taken from me, hadn't declared was needed for household expenses the way she'd taken everything else, every birthday check from relatives, every small inheritance my mother had left, everything absorbed into the household budget, into Leslie's designer handbags, into Tanner's gaming equipment, into everything except me. And now I was outside, literally outside, and the cold, the 30 below cold that Minneapolis reserves for the cruelest nights, it wasn't gradual, wasn't something you could adjust to. It hit like a physical assault, like the air itself was trying to kill me, stripping oxygen from my lungs, turning my eyelashes into tiny icicles, making my skin burn and then go numb, and I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 20, watching through that frosted glass as my father, Scott, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd read me bedtime stories, who'd promised after Mom died that he'd never let anything bad happen to me. I watched him watch me, and I waited for him to unlock the door, to tell Leslie this was too far, to choose his daughter over his wife for once, just once. But he didn't. He just stood there, and then he turned his back, actually physically turned away, and I saw his shoulders slump, saw what looked like relief in his posture, like he'd been waiting for this moment, like my 18th birthday was his liberation, his freedom from having to pretend he cared. And that relief, that visible unburdening, it hurt worse than the cold, hurt worse than Leslie's cruelty, because Leslie had never pretended to love me, had never lied about what I was to her. But my father, he'd lied for years, had let me believe that deep down he was on my side, that he was just weak, just controlled by Leslie, just waiting for the right moment to stand up for me. Except that moment had come, had arrived in the form of his daughter standing in a blizzard, and he'd calculated the cost of opening that door, had weighed my life against Leslie's anger. And he'd chosen, had made his choice clear, and I understood then. Understood with the kind of clarity that only comes from absolute betrayal, that he'd been making that choice every day for years, just in smaller ways, just in increments I'd convinced myself didn't matter, but they'd added up, had accumulated into this moment, into me standing outside freezing while he stood inside warm, and the transaction was complete. The decision was final. I was no longer his problem, no longer his daughter, in any way that required sacrifice or discomfort. I was just a girl he used to know, a mistake from his first marriage, an obligation that had finally, legally expired. I started walking because standing still meant dying, meant letting the cold seep deeper, meant giving up, and I wasn't ready to give up, wasn't ready to let Leslie win this completely, this finally. So I walked one foot in front of the other, boots crunching on ice so hard it sounded like breaking glass, heading toward the abandoned garden shed 3 blocks away, the shed I'd been using as a hiding spot for years. Since I was maybe 13, since the first time Leslie had locked me out of the house for talking back, for existing too loudly, for breathing wrong, And that shed, it wasn't warm, wasn't safe exactly, but it had walls, had some protection from the wind, had blankets I'd stashed there over the years, emergency supplies for nights when home was more dangerous than the cold, and I was maybe halfway there, maybe 2 blocks from the house, when a hand shot out from the shadows and grabbed my wrist, and I should have screamed, should have been terrified, but the cold had stolen my voice, had made my throat too raw, too frozen, and the hand was iron tight, was pulling me into an alley, and I looked up into the face of Miss Agatha, the homeless woman who lived on the corner, who I'd given money to sometimes, who Leslie had specifically told me never to talk to, never to acknowledge, because associating with people like that reflected poorly on our family. And Miss Agatha, her face was maybe 60 years old, maybe 70, weathered by years of street living, but her eyes were sharp, were intelligent, were looking at me with something that looked like terror, like she was more scared than I was, and she said, her voice rough but urgent, her grip on my wrist tightening, "Do not sleep in that shed tonight, child. Do not go there, get a hotel room. Use whatever money you have, but do not go back to that shed. If you go there, you won't wake up." And I stared at her, tried to understand what she was saying, tried to make sense of a warning that seemed paranoid, seemed crazy, because how would sleeping in a shed be worse than walking around in 30 below weather? How would shelter be more dangerous than exposure? But Miss Agatha wasn't letting go, wasn't backing down. She was shaking my arms slightly, trying to make me understand, trying to communicate something urgent, something important, something she knew that I didn't. And she said the Starlight Motel, 2 blocks that way, $40 a night. They don't check ID. They don't ask questions. Go there. Stay there. Don't go to the shed. Promise me. And I wanted to ask why, wanted to understand, wanted to know how she knew about the shed, how she knew I was heading there, how she knew anything about my life. But my teeth were chattering too hard to form words. My body was shaking too violently to do anything except nod, except agree, except take her advice, because what choice did I have? What option did I have except trust the homeless woman who just materialized from the shadows with a warning that felt both insane and absolutely critical? And Miss Agatha released my wrist, pushed me gently in the direction of the motel, and disappeared back into the alley, back into the darkness, like she'd never been there, like I'd imagined her, except the warmth from her grip was still on my wrist, the urgency in her voice was still echoing in my ears, and I changed direction, started walking toward the Starlight Motel instead of the shed, not because I believed her exactly, not because I understood, but because something in her eyes had been real, had been afraid for me, and nobody had been afraid for me in a long time. Nobody had shown that kind of concern, that kind of care, and if a homeless woman was more worried about my survival than my own father, then maybe I should listen. The Starlight Motel was exactly what you'd expect, neon sign flickering, half the letters burned out so it read Star-I-M-O-L, the kind of place you see in true crime documentaries, the kind of place where bad things happen and nobody asks questions. And walking into the lobby felt like walking into a different world. Warm air hitting my frozen face, so hard it hurt, made my skin burn, made my eyes water. And the clerk behind the desk didn't look up from his phone, didn't acknowledge me, just waited while I approached, while I pulled crumpled bills from my pocket with fingers so cold they barely bent, and I slid $40 across the counter, the laminate surface sticky with something I didn't want to identify, and the clerk, middle-aged, bored, existing in that space of not caring about anything except his paycheck. He still didn't look up, just slid a key across the counter, room 12. Key was actual metal, old-fashioned, attached to a plastic diamond that said Starlight in faded letters, and he didn't ask for ID, didn't ask why an 18-year-old girl was checking in alone at midnight with nothing but a backpack, didn't ask anything, because this was the kind of place where questions cost more than they were worth, where seeing nothing and knowing nothing was the business model. And I took the key, walked down a hallway that smelled like cigarette smoke and mildew, found room 12, unlocked it, stepped inside, and locked it behind me, and the room was freezing, was barely warmer than outside, and I cranked the heater until it rattled and groaned and started pumping out air that smelled like burning dust, like old electronics, like desperation, and I sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing my coat, still shaking, watching my breath form clouds in the air. And this was the moment. This was supposed to be the moment where I broke down, where the tears came, where I let myself feel everything I'd been holding back, the betrayal, the abandonment, the fear, but my eyes stayed dry, stayed clear because crying required energy I didn't have, required a belief that someone cared about my pain, and nobody cared, nobody was coming, nobody was going to rescue me. I was alone, completely alone, and instead of crying I started thinking, started analyzing, started doing what I'd learned to do over years of living with Leslie, which was survive, which was calculate, which was figure out the next move, and I thought about my father, about Scott who'd turned his back, and I realized something I should have realized years ago. Realized that he wasn't a victim, wasn't bullied, wasn't weak, he was complicit, was actively choosing Leslie over me every single day, was trading my dignity, my safety, my life for his comfort, for his peace, for the ease of not having to fight, and that realization, that understanding, it wasn't painful exactly. It was clarifying, was like putting on glasses after years of blurry vision, was seeing clearly for the first time that the father I'd loved was gone, had maybe never existed, had been replaced by, or had always been a man who calculated costs, who weighed options, who decided that his daughter's life was worth less than his wife's approval. And understanding that, accepting that, it freed me from hoping, from waiting, from believing that someday he'd change, someday he'd choose me, because he'd already chosen, had made his choice permanent, and I was done hoping, done waiting, done being the daughter who believed in a father who didn't exist. Let me ask you something, and I really need you to think about this. Have you ever had that moment where you realized that the person you thought was protecting you was actually calculating whether you were worth protecting? Type betrayal if you've been there. Type family if you understand what I'm talking about, because I need to know if anyone watching this gets it, gets that sometimes the cruelest thing isn't the person who hurts you. It's the person who watches you get hurt and decides you're not worth the cost of intervention. And my father, he'd been doing that calculation for years. Every time Leslie was cruel, every time she took something from me, every time she made me smaller, he'd calculated, had weighed, had decided that stopping her would cost him more than losing me. And tonight he'd made that calculation visible, had shown me clearly that when it came down to it, when it was a choice between my life and his comfort, he chose comfort, chose warmth, chose the easy path, and I was the cost, was the sacrifice, was the acceptable loss. And understanding that, sitting in that freezing motel room, I felt something shift, felt something harden, felt the last piece of the girl who wanted her father's love die, and in her place was someone else, someone colder, someone harder, someone who understood that family wasn't about blood, wasn't about obligation, wasn't about what you were supposed to feel, it was about who chose you, who fought for you, who thought you were worth protecting. And my father had failed that test, had failed it completely, had failed it so thoroughly that I was here, in this room, alone, and he was home, warm, relieved, and that relief, that visible unburdening I'd seen in his posture, it told me everything I needed to know about what I'd been to him, which was a burden, which was a problem, which was something he'd been waiting to discard. And now that I was 18, now that I was legally an adult, he was free, was finally free of the daughter who'd been a reminder of his first wife, a complication in his second marriage, an obligation he'd never wanted, and I was free too, free of hoping, free of trying, free of being the daughter who believed love could be earned if she was just good enough, quiet enough, invisible enough. I was free to survive, to fight, to become whoever I needed to become without the weight of his expectations, his disappointment, his calculations about whether I was worth keeping. And that freedom, it was terrible, was painful, was exactly what I needed. And sitting there watching the heater struggle to warm the room, I checked the lock on the door, wedged a chair under the handle. And I understood that I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a survivor, was a problem they'd tried to dispose of. And tomorrow I was going to find out exactly why Miss Agatha had looked so terrified, exactly what would have happened if I'd gone to that shed, exactly what my family had planned for me that was worse than exile, worse than abandonment, worse than everything that had already happened. Because Miss Agatha's warning hadn't been crazy, hadn't been paranoid, had been specific, had been urgent, had been the warning of someone who knew something, who'd seen something, who understood that my birthday wasn't just the day I became an adult, it was the day I became a threat, and threats in my family didn't get exiled, they got eliminated. And I was alive tonight only because a homeless woman had grabbed my wrist, had forced me to listen, had saved me from something I didn't yet understand but was about to discover. And that discovery, that understanding of what my family had actually planned, that was coming, was inevitable, was going to change everything I thought I knew about betrayal, about family, about how far people would go to protect money, to protect secrets, to protect themselves from the inconvenient truth that I existed, that I had rights, that I was about to become very, very dangerous to them. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. Every sound from the hallway made my body tense, made me wonder if they'd found me, if Leslie had sent Tanner, my stepbrother who was 17 and had spent the last 5 years looking at me with something that wasn't quite hatred but was definitely malice, was definitely the look of someone who enjoyed my suffering, who found entertainment in my fear. And lying on that mattress that smelled like cigarette smoke and desperation, I kept replaying Miss Agatha's warning, kept hearing the terror in her voice, the urgency, the specific instruction not to go to the shed, and I couldn't understand it, couldn't make the pieces fit because yes, the shed was cold, yes, I might have frozen, but wasn't that obvious? Wasn't that the risk of sleeping anywhere in 30 below weather? So why had she been so insistent, so specific, so afraid, unless there was something I didn't know, something she'd seen, something that made the shed not just dangerous but deadly in a way that went beyond temperature, and that thought, that possibility, it kept me awake, kept me alert, kept me waiting for morning so I could find her, so I could demand answers, so I could understand why a homeless woman cared more about my survival than my own family. And when the sun finally started to lighten the sky, when the digital clock on the nightstand clicked over to 6 a.m., I got up, washed my face in a sink that had rust stains and water pressure that barely qualified as flow, and I walked back out into the cold, into a morning that was marginally warmer, maybe -20 instead of -30, and I went looking for Miss Agatha. Went to the corner where she usually stayed, the alcove behind the closed bakery where she'd set up camp with blankets and cardboard, but she wasn't there. Her stuff was there, her shopping cart with the broken wheel, her nest of blankets, but she was gone, and I felt panic rising, felt like maybe I'd imagined her. Maybe the cold had made me hallucinate. Maybe the warning had been my own subconscious trying to keep me alive. But then I saw the note, a piece of cardboard with writing in black marker, Sydney, 24-hour diner, 2 blocks east. I'm waiting, and she'd known my name, had known where to find me, had left instructions like she'd known I'd come looking, and that knowledge, that preparation, it wasn't random, wasn't coincidence, was evidence of someone who'd been watching, who'd been paying attention, who knew things about my life that a homeless woman should know, and I followed the directions, walked 2 blocks east to a diner that looked like it had been there since the 1950s, red vinyl booths and chrome trim and windows fogged with condensation, and inside it was warm, was bright, smelled like coffee and bacon and something approaching normal, and Miss Agatha was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee that she'd probably been making last for hours, waiting for me. And when I slid into the seat across from her, when I looked at her in proper light for the first time, I realized she wasn't what I'd thought, wasn't just a crazy homeless lady. She was sharp, was alert, had eyes that were clear and intelligent, had posture that suggested someone who'd been someone before the street, someone professional, someone educated, someone who'd fallen but hadn't broken, and she looked at me with something like relief, like she'd been afraid I wouldn't come, like she'd been afraid I'd ignored her warning, and she reached into a tattered bag, pulled out a tablet. The screen was cracked but functional, and she slid it across the table, and she said, her voice rough but precise, her words chosen carefully, I used to be a legal secretary, Sydney, 30 years at Morrison and Bradshaw downtown. I know how people hide things, I know how they get sloppy, I know how to find evidence, and I've been watching your family for 3 months. Ever since I heard your stepmother talking on her phone outside Starbucks about how your 18th birthday was coming, about how they needed to handle it, about how the trust fund was about to become a problem, and I didn't understand at first, didn't know what it meant, but I started paying attention, started watching, started documenting, because I've seen this before. I've seen families destroy each other over money. I've seen what people do when inheritance becomes more valuable than children, and what I found, Sydney, what I captured, it's going to change everything. She pressed play on the tablet, and the video was night vision footage, green and grainy, the kind that comes from trail cameras, the kind hunters use, and the timestamp said 11:45 p.m., 45 minutes after I'd been kicked out, 45 minutes after I should have been in that shed, and I watched as a figure walked into frame, backlit by moonlight reflecting off snow, and even in the grainy footage I recognized him, recognized the walk, recognized the coat, recognized my Stepbrother Tanner, and he was carrying something, a shovel, a big one, the kind you use for serious digging, for serious work, and I watched, my stomach turning to lead, my breath stopping as he approached the shed, the shed where I should have been sleeping, and he didn't knock, didn't check if I was inside, didn't call my name, he just started working, started shoveling snow. Not away from the door, like you would if you were trying to help someone, but against it, packing it thick. Heavy, wet snow, layer after layer, building a wall, a barrier, banking it up against the only exit until it was solid, until it was 3 feet high, until it was immovable, and he worked methodically, worked carefully, checked the corners, packed it tight, and then he checked the windows that were already boarded up from the outside, boarded up years ago when the shed had been declared unsafe, and he checked them like he was verifying, like he was making sure, like he was confirming that there was no escape, no way out, no possibility of survival, and then he stopped, stood back, looked at the shed with satisfaction, with completion, with the expression of someone who'd finished a job, solved a problem, tied up a loose end, and he pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, his face illuminated by the screen. And then he laughed, actually laughed. The sound wasn't audible on the footage, but I could see his shoulders shake, could see his mouth open, could see the expression of someone who found this funny, who found attempted murder amusing, who thought sealing his stepsister in a shed to freeze to death was entertainment. And then he walked away, walked back toward the house, walked back to warmth while I should have been dying, should have been trapped, should have been suffocating in a shed that was becoming a tomb, and the video ended, cut to black. And I sat there staring at the screen, staring at proof, at evidence, at documentation of what my family had planned, what they'd tried to do. What would have happened if Miss Agatha hadn't grabbed my wrist, if she hadn't warned me, if I'd gone to that shed the way I'd planned? And I understood then, understood with absolute horrifying clarity, that the eviction wasn't punishment, wasn't cruelty, wasn't just Leslie being vindictive. It was set up, was premeditation, was attempted murder dressed up as tough love, and they'd almost gotten away with it, would have gotten away with it, because who investigates when a homeless 18-year-old freezes to death? Who asks questions when a family can say she ran away, we tried to help her, she was troubled, she made bad choices? Who demands forensic evidence when the cold is explanation enough? And they'd calculated that, had planned for that, had known that my death would look natural, would look like consequence rather than crime, would give them everything they wanted, which wasn't just my absence, was something bigger, something worth killing for, something Miss Agatha had mentioned, the trust fund, my grandfather's trust fund that I'd forgotten about, that I barely thought about, that I'd assumed had been absorbed into the family finances years ago the way everything else had been absorbed, but apparently not. Apparently it still existed. Apparently it was still mine. And apparently my 18th birthday wasn't just the day I became an adult, it was the day I could claim it, could access it, could take control of money that they wanted, that they needed, that they were willing to kill me to keep. If I'd been in there, Miss Agatha said quietly, her voice careful, her eyes watching my face, if you'd fallen asleep, the temperature was dropping to 30 below, with the door barricaded, the airflow would have been cut off, the cold would have seeped in, carbon dioxide would have built up, you wouldn't have woken up, Sydney, you would have died, and in the morning they would have found you, would have called the police, would have cried appropriate tears, would have told everyone you'd run away. You'd always been troubled. They tried to help, but you were stubborn. They'd warned you about sleeping rough, and nobody would have questioned it. Nobody would have investigated. Nobody would have known it was murder, because it would have looked like neglect, like bad choices, like a tragic consequence of teenage rebellion. And I stared at her, at this woman who'd saved my life, at this homeless woman who'd been watching when nobody else cared, who'd documented when nobody else noticed, who'd intervened when my own family had decided I was disposable. And I asked the question that had been building since I'd seen that video. Why? I whispered. Why would they do this? Why not just let me leave? I was already gone. I was already out. Why murder? Why go that far? And Miss Agatha looked at me with something like pity, with something like understanding, and she said, because you turning 18 means the trust fund unlocks, means you can access it, means you can claim it, and if you're not there to sign for it, if you're dead, if you're gone, who gets it? Your father, your legal guardian, the person who inherits when there's no will, when there's no beneficiary, when the primary recipient is deceased. And it hit me then, hit me like physical impact, like being punched in the chest. The trust fund, my grandfather's trust fund that I'd been told was gone, was spent, was absorbed into household expenses. It wasn't gone, was substantial, was significant, was worth killing. And my 18th birthday wasn't liberation, wasn't freedom, wasn't the day I became an adult. It was the day I became a threat, became an obstacle, became something that stood between them and money they'd already spent mentally, money they'd already borrowed against, money they needed to survive because I'd seen the signs, had noticed the small things, the way Leslie had stopped buying designer bags, the way the groceries had gotten cheaper, the way bills had started sitting on the counter longer, the way my father had started looking stressed, looking worried, looking like someone who was drowning financially, and I'd assumed it was normal, was just adult problems, was just the cost of living, but now I understood it was desperation, was debt, was the slow collapse of a lifestyle built on credit and expectations, and my trust fund, the money my grandfather had left specifically for me, protected from my father's access until I turned 18, that money was there. Salvation was their escape, was the only thing standing between them and financial ruin, except I was in the way, was the obstacle, was the person who could claim it, who could take it, who could leave them with nothing, and they decided, had calculated, had planned, that my death was cheaper than my survival, was easier than negotiation, was cleaner than admitting they'd been stealing from me for years, planning to steal more, had built their entire future on money that was mine, and now that I was old enough to claim it, they needed me gone, needed me dead, needed me to disappear in a way that looked natural, looked unfortunate, looked like anything except what it actually was, which was premeditated murder, was conspiracy, was a family deciding that money mattered more than life, more than blood, more than 18 years of pretending to care, and sitting there in that diner, holding that tablet, looking at evidence of my own attempted murder, I felt something change, felt something harden, felt the last piece of the girl who'd believed in family, who'd hoped for love, who'd thought maybe someday they'd choose her. That girl died completely, died finally, and in her place was someone else, someone angrier, someone colder, someone who understood that this wasn't about love, wasn't about family, wasn't about anything except survival, and if they wanted war, if they wanted to treat this as transaction, as calculation, as cost-benefit analysis where my life was the cost, then I was going to show them what happened when you miscalculated, when you underestimated, when you tried to kill someone who was smarter than you realized, stronger than you assumed, more dangerous than you could imagine, because I wasn't going to run, wasn't going to hide, wasn't going to let them win by default. I was going to fight, was going to use every weapon available, was going to make absolutely certain that their attempt to murder me became the biggest mistake of their lives, and that mistake, that failure, was going to cost them everything, was going to destroy them completely, was going to teach them that some people don't die quietly, don't disappear conveniently, don't accept being disposed of without consequences, and I was one of those people, was exactly the wrong person to underestimate, and they were about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible because I had evidence, had witnesses, had documentation, had everything I needed to not just survive but to destroy, and destruction was exactly what I was planning, was what justice required, was what 18 years of abuse and one night of attempted murder had earned them, and they were going to pay, were going to lose everything, were going to understand that the girl they'd thrown away, the daughter they'd tried to murder, was actually the person who would end them, and that ending was starting now, was beginning with this video, was launching with my decision to stop being victim and start being prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner of consequences they'd spent years avoiding but were about to experience in full. And Miss Agatha looked at me, saw something in my face, saw the shift, saw the transformation, and she smiled, smiled with approval, with understanding, with the recognition that I'd made a choice, had crossed a line, had become someone capable of fighting back, and she said quietly, firmly, "Good girl. Now let's go bury them." Miss Agatha drove us to the 4th precinct in her battered station wagon that smelled like old upholstery and years of street living, and I sat in the passenger seat clutching that tablet like it was a weapon, like it was ammunition, like it was the difference between being believed and being dismissed. And during the drive, Miss Agatha told me things, told me about her life before the street, about being a legal secretary for 30 years, about knowing exactly how evidence worked, about Understanding chain of custody and documentation, and what made cases prosecutable versus what made them dismissible. And she said, her voice steady, her eyes on the road, I mounted that camera 3 months ago, Sydney, the day I heard your stepmother on her phone talking about timing, about your birthday, about how they needed to handle you, and I didn't know what it meant at first, didn't understand, but I've worked enough family law cases to recognize the language of inheritance disputes, too. Hear the subtext when someone says a child is becoming a problem, and I started watching, started documenting, started building a file because I've seen this before. I've seen families destroy each other over money. I've seen parents who view children as obstacles rather than people. And I saw the way your stepmother looked at you when you walked past, saw the calculation in her eyes, saw someone measuring cost versus benefit. And I knew something bad was coming. I just didn't know how. Bad until last night. Until I reviewed the footage, until I saw your stepbrother sealing that shed, and I drove straight to find you, drove to every place you might go, and when I saw you walking toward that shed, when I grabbed your wrist, I was more terrified than I've been in years, because I knew what was waiting for you, knew what they'd prepared, knew that if you went in there you wouldn't come out, and I couldn't let that happen, couldn't let another child die because adults valued money over life, so I intervened, broke my rule about not getting involved, risked exposing myself, risked everything because some things matter more than survival. Some things require action even when action is dangerous. And saving you, warning you, that was worth the risk, was worth breaking cover, was worth everything. And hearing that, understanding that this woman, this homeless woman who had nothing, who lived on corners and ate from dumpsters and existed in the margins of society, had risked what little safety she had to save me, had documented everything, had built a case, had intervened when my own family had planned my murder. It made something in my chest crack open, made tears threaten for the first time since being thrown out. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude, of recognition that kindness existed, that people could care, that strangers could be more family than blood. And I reached over and squeezed her hand, just once, just briefly, because words weren't enough, weren't adequate, weren't sufficient to express what her intervention meant, what her documentation meant, what her belief that I was worth saving meant to someone who'd spent 18 years being told she wasn't worth anything. The police station was exactly what you'd expect, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the atmosphere of bureaucracy and exhaustion, of people who'd seen too much to be shocked by anything, and the desk sergeant looked up when we entered, looked at Miss Agatha with the kind of dismissive judgment that street people get used to. The automatic assumption that anything she said would be unreliable, would be the ravings of someone mentally unstable. Someone whose testimony meant nothing, but Miss Agatha didn't flinch, didn't react, just said in her precise legal secretary voice, her 30 years of professional experience bleeding through, "We need to speak with a detective about attempted murder. We have video evidence, we have documentation, and this is time-sensitive. The victim is present, the suspects are still at liberty, and we need immediate intervention." And something in her tone, something in the way she spoke, made the sergeant pause, made him actually look at her, actually listen, and he picked up his phone, made a call, and 5 minutes later we were sitting in an interview room with Detective Miller, a man maybe 50 years old with salt and pepper hair, and a permanent expression of having seen everything, having heard every excuse, having witnessed every variety of human cruelty, and he sat across from us, opened a notebook, and said, "Tell me what happened," and I told him about the eviction, about being thrown out at 11 p.m. into 30 below weather, about Miss Agatha's warning, about the video, and then Miss Agatha played the footage of Tanner sealing the shed, and Detective Miller watched without blinking, watched the entire thing, and when it ended he leaned back in his chair, rubbed his jaw, and said, his voice carefully neutral, his cop face firmly in place, "Attempted manslaughter. Possibly attempted murder, if we can prove premeditation, reckless endangerment at minimum. He paused, this is serious, this is prosecutable, we can pick him up today," and I should have felt relieved, should have felt vindicated, should have felt safe, but instead I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach because something about this felt incomplete, felt like we were missing something, like Tanner was just the weapon, just the tool, but not the architect, not the planner, not the person who designed this. And I said, what about my stepmother, what about Leslie? Because she's the one who kicked me out, she's the one who chose the timing, she's the one who would benefit from my death. And Detective Miller shook his head, said the video shows the boy, shows Tanner. We can question him about her involvement, We can investigate the conspiracy angle, but right now the warrant is for him, the evidence is against him, and we move on what we can prove. And I understood that the legal system, the machinery of justice, it moved slowly, moved carefully, moved on evidence rather than certainty, and Leslie had been smart, had kept herself distant, had used Tanner as her weapon, as her proxy, as the person who'd take the fall if anything went wrong. And she'd calculated that too, had measured that cost, had decided that sacrificing her son was acceptable if it meant keeping herself clean, keeping herself free, keeping access to the money that was worth more than either of her children. And that calculation, that willingness to throw away not just me but her own son, it was monstrous, was beyond anything I'd imagined, was proof that she wasn't just cruel, she was sociopathic, was someone who saw people as pieces on a board, as resources to be used, as obstacles to be removed, and nothing mattered more than winning, than getting what she wanted, than accessing money that would solve all her problems. And I was the problem, was the obstacle, was the one thing standing between her and financial salvation, and she'd tried to remove me, had almost succeeded, would have succeeded if not for Miss Agatha's intervention. And now we were fighting back, we're using the system, we're building a case, but it felt slow, felt inadequate, felt like we were playing by rules Leslie had no intention of following, and that asymmetry, that fundamental unfairness, it made me understand that this wasn't over, wasn't resolved, wasn't finished just because we'd gone to the police, because Leslie wasn't done, wasn't defeated, was probably right now calculating her next move, her next strategy, her next attempt to neutralize me before I could claim what was mine. And that attempt, that escalation, it was coming, was inevitable, was going to be worse than the shed, because now she knew I'd survived, knew I was still alive, knew I was a threat that needed to be eliminated more urgently, more desperately, more completely than before. And understanding that, sitting in that police station, I realized that going to the police wasn't the end of this, was just the beginning, was just the first move in a game that was going to get more dangerous, more desperate, more violent before it resolved. And I needed to be ready, needed to be prepared, needed to understand that the family that had tried to kill me once would absolutely try again, and next time they wouldn't be subtle, wouldn't be careful, wouldn't leave evidence, because now they knew I was dangerous, knew I was smart enough to survive, knew I was the kind of threat that required permanent elimination. And that knowledge, that understanding, it changed how I thought about the next steps, about what came after the police, about how to protect myself from people who'd already proven they'd rather see me dead than let me live with what was rightfully mine. Detective Miller made the arrest that afternoon, called in patrol officers, sent them to the house, to my father's house, to the place I'd lived for 18 years, and they picked up Tanner, put him in handcuffs, read him his rights, took him downtown, and I thought that would be the end of it. Thought that would be the moment Leslie realized she'd lost, thought she'd retreat, would lawyer up, would focus on defending Tanner rather than attacking me. But I underestimated her, underestimated the sheer desperation of a woman watching her entire plan collapse, watching her financial salvation slip away, watching the child she'd tried to eliminate survive and fight back, because my burner phone, the phone I'd bought that morning with money Miss Agatha had loaned me, buzzed 2 hours after the arrest, buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and I opened it, read it, felt my blood turn to ice, because the message was clear, was direct, was absolutely terrifying in its simplicity. Come home and sign the papers, Sydney, or the cold won't be the only thing that hurts you. I bailed him out, he's angry, and this is your fault. Fix it or face consequences worse than last night. And I stared at that message, at the threat, at the acknowledgement that she'd bailed him out, had used money, probably trust fund money, probably money that was legally mine to bail out the person who'd tried to murder me. And she wasn't retreating, wasn't backing down, wasn't accepting defeat. She was escalating, was threatening, was making absolutely clear that this wasn't over, that my survival hadn't stopped her, had only made her more desperate, more dangerous, more willing to do whatever it took to eliminate me. And I showed the message to Miss Agatha, showed her proof that Leslie was actively threatening me, actively escalating, actively preparing another attempt, and Miss Agatha read it, her face hardening, her eyes narrowing, and she said, "This is what's called an extinction burst in Psychology, Sydney. It's what happens when a behavior that used to be reinforced suddenly stops working, when a toddler screams louder because you stop giving them candy, when a manipulator realizes their control is gone. They don't retreat, they escalate, they increase the intensity, the frequency, the severity of their attempts to regain control, because they're not thinking rationally anymore, they're not calculating costs, they're just reacting, just panicking, just doing anything to restore the status quo. And your stepmother, she spent years controlling your father, controlling the money, controlling you, and now that control is gone. The deadline is approaching. You're 48 hours from being able to legally claim that trust fund, and she's losing everything, and cornered animals attack. Sydney, they don't surrender, they don't negotiate, they attack. And Leslie is cornered, is desperate, is about to become more dangerous than she's ever been, and you need to understand that, need to be prepared for that. Need to protect yourself, because she's not going to stop, not going to give up, not going to let you claim that money if she has any power to prevent it, and the only thing that will stop her is making sure she has no power, no access, no ability to hurt you, and that means we need to move faster, need to move smarter, need to get you to that bank, need to get those papers signed, need to transfer control before she can make another attempt. Because every hour you wait is another hour she has to plan, to scheme, to find a way to eliminate you. And we're running out of time, Sydney, we're running out of safety, we're running out of buffer between you and someone who's proven she's willing to kill, and we need to act now, today, immediately, before she makes good on that threat, before the cold becomes the least of your worries. I need to pause here because I need you to understand something that's crucial, that's important. That's the difference between surviving family betrayal and becoming another statistic. Type dangerous if you've ever dealt with someone who escalated when cornered. Type desperate if you've seen how people react when they're losing control of money, of power, of the ability to manipulate. Because what was happening to me? What Leslie was doing, it wasn't unique, wasn't special, wasn't some rare exception. This was pattern, was playbook, was exactly what happens when inheritance meets desperation, when money becomes more valuable than life, when family stops being about love and becomes about transaction, about calculation, about who gets what when the matriarch or patriarch dies. And I need you to see this, to recognize this, because maybe you're dealing with it too. Maybe someone in your family is calculating your worth versus the cost of keeping you alive. Maybe you're approaching 18, approaching 20. 1. Approaching whatever age triggers access to money someone else wants, and you need to know, need to understand, need to accept that family will absolutely hurt you if the math makes sense, if the benefit outweighs the risk, if they think they can get away with it, and the only protection, the only defense, the only thing that saves you is documentation, is witnesses, is building a case before they make their move. Because once they move, once they act, you're either dead or you're fighting from behind. And fighting from behind against people who know you, who've raised you, who understand your vulnerabilities, that's nearly impossible. That's survival against odds that shouldn't be survivable. And I was surviving only because Miss Agatha had been watching, had been documenting, had intervened at exactly the right moment. But not everyone has a Miss Agatha. Not everyone has someone watching, someone caring, someone willing to risk themselves to save a stranger. So you have to be your own Miss Agatha, have to be your own witness, your own documentarian, your own defense, and from our stats we've got way more viewers than subscribers. If you're following this story, if you need to know how this ends, if you're living some version of this yourself and need to see that survival is possible, kindly join our community and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next? What happened when Leslie realized I wasn't coming home, when she understood I wasn't going to sign those papers, when she decided that threats weren't working and direct action was required, that's coming, and you need to see it, need to understand how far desperate people go, need to know what to watch for, what to protect against, what to document, because this story, my story, it's not unique, it's just documented, it's just visible, it's just being told by someone who survived to tell it, and telling it, sharing it, making it public. That's how we protect others. That's how we warn people. That's how we make sure that the next child approaching inheritance, the next person becoming a threat to family money, they have information, have warning, have knowledge that might save their life the way Miss Agatha's warning saved mine. My phone buzzed again, more messages, and these weren't threats anymore. These were actions. These were Leslie systematically destroying my digital life, my access to anything I'd built. Account frozen, the text said, then another notification, access denied, then another, password changed, then another, account closed, and I watched in real time as she locked me out of my student email, my bank account, the small savings account I'd managed to hide from her, the PayPal, where I'd been accumulating babysitting money, Everything, every small safety net, every tiny reserve. She was destroying it, was cutting off access, was trying to starve me out, was making sure I had no resources, no options, no choice except to come home, to surrender, to sign whatever papers she put in front of me. And it was strategic, was calculated, was the tactics of someone who'd thought about this, who'd planned for resistance, who'd prepared multiple pressure points, multiple ways to force compliance. And I watched it happen, watched my small financial life disappear, and I felt rage, felt pure crystalline rage, because this wasn't just about the money. This was about control, was about Leslie proving that even now, even after everything, she could still hurt me, could still take from me, could still demonstrate that I had no power, no agency, no protection except what she allowed. And that demonstration, that performance of power, it was meant to break me, was meant to drive me back, was meant to make me understand that resistance was futile, that she would always win, that money and legal access and adult authority would always triumph over a teenager with nothing, except I wasn't nothing, wasn't powerless, wasn't alone, because Miss Agatha was sitting next to me, was watching this happen, was already on her phone calling legal aid, calling the bank, calling Consumer Protection Services, building a case for financial abuse, for illegal account closure, for violations of banking regulations, and she was doing it with the precision of someone who knew the system, who understood the laws, who knew exactly which regulations Leslie had just violated. And while Leslie was busy cutting off my access, was busy demonstrating her power, she was also busy creating evidence, was documenting her own crimes, was building the case against herself, because every account she closed, every access she denied, every action she took, it was evidence of financial abuse, was proof of coercion, was documentation that would matter later, would matter in court, would matter when prosecutors were deciding what charges to file. And Leslie, in her desperation, in her panic, in her extinction burst of control, was handing us everything we needed to destroy her, and she didn't even know it, didn't understand that the same actions that felt like power were actually creating the rope she'd hang herself with. And understanding that, seeing that, recognizing that her escalation was actually her destruction. It gave me hope, gave me strength, gave me the certainty that I was going to win this, was going to survive this, was going to make absolutely certain that every action she took, every threat she made, every violation she committed would be used against her, would become evidence, would become the foundation of consequences she couldn't imagine, couldn't avoid, couldn't buy her way out of, because justice, real justice, was coming, and it was going to be absolute, was going to be permanent, was going to teach her, and everyone like her, that children aren't disposable, aren't obstacles, aren't acceptable losses in pursuit of money, and the people who treat them that way, who try to eliminate them, who calculate their worth in dollars versus cents, those people face consequences, real consequences, permanent consequences, and those consequences were coming for Leslie, were coming for my father, were coming for everyone who'd participated in this, who'd known about this, who decided that my life was worth less than their financial stability. And that coming, that reckoning, that justice, it was going to be beautiful, was going to be complete, was going to be exactly what they deserved, and so much worse than anything they'd anticipated, because they'd underestimated me, had miscalculated, had thought I was weak, was disposable, was someone who'd die quietly without fighting back. And they were wrong, were catastrophically wrong. We're about to learn exactly how wrong, and that learning, that lesson, that education in consequences, it was starting now, was beginning with documentation, was launching with our trip to the bank, where I was going to claim what was mine, was going to take control, was going to become not just survivor, but victor. And that victory, that transformation, that moment when I stopped being victim and became the person who destroyed them, that was next, was coming, was inevitable, and they had no idea, had no warning, had no preparation, because they'd spent so long underestimating me that they'd forgotten to notice I was becoming dangerous, was becoming powerful, was becoming exactly the kind of enemy you never want to make, and making me, turning me into this. That was their biggest mistake, their fatal error, their catastrophic miscalculation, and they were about to pay for it with everything they had, everything they'd valued more than me, everything they'd been willing to kill for, and I was going to take it all, was going to leave them with nothing, was going to make absolutely certain they understood that the daughter they'd thrown away, the child they'd tried to murder, was actually the person who'd end them completely, permanently, finally. Miss Agatha and I walked into First National Bank downtown at exactly 9 a.m., the moment they opened, and I was wearing the black blazer I'd bought for debate club, the white blouse that was slightly wrinkled but clean, the only professional outfit I owned. And Miss Agatha had insisted I dress like this, had said you can't walk into a bank looking like a victim, you need to look like someone who owns something, who knows something, who belongs somewhere, and she was right, was absolutely right, because the way people looked at me changed when I wore that blazer, stopped seeing homeless teenager and started seeing someone who might matter, who might have resources, who might be worth taking seriously. And we walked up to the reception desk, me holding my grandfather's death certificate, my birth certificate, my driver's license, every document Miss Agatha had helped me gather that morning from public records, from online databases, from the careful organization she'd maintained. Despite living on streets, and the receptionist, a woman maybe 40 years old with perfect makeup and a smile that was professional but distant, looked up and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing, even though every instinct was screaming that I didn't belong here, that I was an imposter, that someone would recognize me and throw me out. I said, "I'm Sydney Carter. I'm here to see the senior trustee for the Harold Carter estate. I'm the beneficiary. I need to access my trust fund." And I watched her face change, watched the automatic dismissal shift to uncertainty, watched her look at my documents, at my ID, at the death certificate, and she said, "You have an appointment." And before I could answer, before I could feel the rejection coming, the glass doors behind us opened, slid apart with that expensive whisper of well-maintained machinery, and Leslie walked in, strode in, flanked by my father, who looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, and by a man in a cheap suit who was obviously a lawyer, some cut-rate attorney Leslie had dug up to give her threats legal weight. And Leslie saw me, stopped, her face cycling through surprise, then anger, then quickly arranging itself into concerned mother expression. The mask she wore so well, the performance she'd perfected over years of manipulating everyone around her, and she rushed toward me, arms open like she was going to hug me, like she was relieved, like she'd been worried. And her voice was perfect, was exactly right, was the sound of a mother who'd found her lost child. "Sydney, thank God we found you. We've been so worried. You're not well, honey. You need to come home. We can talk about the trust later. There's no rush. You're confused." And I saw what she was doing, saw the performance, saw how she was playing to the audience of bank employees, of security guards, of my father who stood behind her looking at the floor, and I said one word, said it loud enough to carry, said it clear enough to cut through her act. "Stop." Leslie froze, stopped mid-reach, her arms still extended, her face still arranged in concern, but something behind her eyes shifted, became harder, became colder, became the real Leslie, the one who'd kicked me into a blizzard, who'd planned my murder, who'd threatened me this morning. And I didn't step back, didn't flinch, didn't give her any ground. I just held up my hand and turned back to the receptionist, said, "Call the trustee. Call them now. I'm the legal beneficiary. I'm 18 years old. I have the documents, and I have the right to access this account." And the lawyer, the man in the cheap suit, stepped forward, his voice officious, his manner aggressive. "Miss, I represent her parents. They have medical power of attorney. She's not in a state to make financial decisions. She's had a breakdown. She's not competent." And Miss Agatha, who'd been standing silent behind me, moved forward, her voice cutting through the lawyer's bluster like a knife, her 30 years of legal secretary experience apparent in every word. "She's perfectly lucid. She has documentation. And unless you have a court order declaring her incompetent, which you don't, because that takes time and hearings and evidence you don't have, she has every legal right to access her own trust fund. Now step back before I call security and have you removed for harassment, intimidation, and interference with banking operations." And the lawyer blinked, surprised, clearly not expecting resistance from a homeless woman, not expecting legal language, not expecting someone who knew the rules, the procedures, the exact boundaries of what he could and couldn't do. And he faltered, looked at Leslie, looked uncertain, and that uncertainty, that moment of hesitation, it was everything, was the crack in their armor, was proof they'd been bluffing, had been relying on intimidation rather than law, on performance rather than authority. And the elevator behind the reception desk pinged, doors opening, and A man emerged, older, maybe 60, gray suit, conservative tie, the kind of person who'd spent decades managing money, managing trust funds, managing the complicated intersections of death and inheritance. And he looked at me, looked at my documents on the desk, looked at Leslie, and he said, "Miss Sydney Carter." And I said, "That's me." And he said, "I'm Mr. Henderson, senior trustee. I've been expecting you." Leslie lunged forward, her mask dropping completely, her voice sharp, desperate. "You can't let her sign anything. She's unstable. She's been living on the streets. She's clearly not competent. She needs help. She needs guidance. She needs adults to protect her." And Mr. Henderson stopped, turned, looked at Leslie with an expression I'd seen judges use, with the cold professional assessment of someone who'd dealt with contested wills, with family fights, with people who valued money over blood. And he said, "Mrs. Carter, the terms of the trust are explicit. Harold Carter established this fund for his granddaughter, to be accessed upon her 18th birthday. The requirements are identification, birth certificate, and beneficiary signature. There is no provision for parental oversight, no requirement for adult approval, no mechanism for interference unless a court has declared the beneficiary incompetent, which would require a formal hearing, medical testimony, and judicial review. Do you have such an order?" And Leslie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and no sound came out, because she didn't have an order, didn't have authority, didn't have anything except lies and threats and the desperate hope that performance would be enough, that she could manipulate her way through this the way she'd manipulated everything else. But Henderson wasn't falling for it, wasn't buying it, wasn't someone who could be intimidated or charmed. He was the gatekeeper, was the guardian of my grandfather's wishes, and those wishes were clear, were documented, were legally binding, and Leslie's performance meant nothing against legal documentation, against trust terms, against the clear, unambiguous instructions of a man who'd known, who'd suspected, who'd planned for exactly this scenario. "I didn't think so," Henderson said, his voice dismissive, final, and he gestured to me and Miss Agatha, "If you'll follow me." And we got in the elevator, me and Miss Agatha and Mr. Henderson, and as the doors closed I saw Leslie's face, saw the mask slip completely, saw the panic beneath, saw someone watching their entire plan collapse, saw desperation so pure it was almost transparent, and my father, Scott, he just stood there, still looking at the floor, still avoiding eye contact, still choosing comfort over action, still being exactly who he'd always been, and I felt nothing looking at him, felt no anger, no sadness, no disappointment, just the vast empty space where father should have been. And then the doors closed, cut them off, and we rose away from them, rose toward the top floor, toward the executive offices, toward the place where my grandfather's trust was managed, where my future was waiting, where justice was about to be delivered in the form of signatures, of legal transfers, of money moving from their control to mine. And that movement, that shift in power, it was everything, was the beginning of their end, was the foundation of consequences they couldn't avoid, couldn't buy their way out of, couldn't manipulate into disappearance. Henderson's office was exactly what you'd expect: leather chairs, mahogany desk, walls lined with law books and framed certificates, the atmosphere of old money carefully managed. And he gestured for us to sit, opened a file that had my name on it, my grandfather's name, thick with documents, with terms, with conditions, and he said, "Miss Carter, your grandfather established this trust 20 years ago, shortly after your mother passed away." He was, Henderson paused, choosing words carefully. "Concerned about how you would be raised, concerned about your stepmother's influence, concerned about ensuring you had resources independent of your father's control." And he was right to be concerned, wasn't he? And I nodded, unable to speak, because hearing that my grandfather had known, had suspected, had planned for this, it made something in my chest crack open, made me understand that someone had loved me, had protected me, had thought I was worth protecting even from beyond the grave. And Henderson continued, said the trust contains the proceeds from sale of his house, his life insurance policy, his investment portfolio. Total value as of your 18th birthday is, he looked at a paper, $637,000, and I stopped breathing, stopped processing, because that number, that amount, it was more than I'd imagined, was more than Leslie had told me, was more than I'd been led to believe existed, and I understood then why they'd been so desperate. Why? Murder had seemed preferable to letting me live, because $600,000 was life-changing, was college tuition, was starting capital, was freedom, was everything they needed to solve their financial problems, pay their debts, maintain their lifestyle, and I was the only thing standing between them and that solution. And $600,000 was apparently worth killing for, was worth attempted murder, was worth throwing your daughter into a blizzard and sealing her in a shed. And that calculation, that value they'd placed on my life, it made me sick, made me furious, made me understand exactly how little I'd mattered compared to money, compared to comfort, compared to maintaining appearances. But there's more, Henderson said, and he pulled out another document, sealed, marked with my grandfather's signature, and dated 1 week before his death. He added a codicil, a negligence liability clause. It stipulates that if you were ever found to be in a state of distress, financial, emotional, or physical, caused by your guardians, the trust would automatically fund a private investigation and prosecution against them. Your grandfather suspected something like this might happen, suspected. Your stepmother would try something, and he built in protections, built in consequences, built in justice. And Henderson opened the sealed document, showed me bank records, spending history, Leslie's credit card statements, evidence of her draining accounts, of using household funds for personal expenses, of borrowing against the house, of financial mismanagement so severe it qualified as fraud. And he said by trying to hurt you, by kicking you out, by attempting what they attempted, they triggered the clause. The trust isn't just yours to access, Sydney. It's now the bankroll for their destruction. Your grandfather set aside $200,000 specifically for legal action if needed, for investigators, for attorneys, for whatever resources are required to hold your guardians accountable. And I have authority as trustee to initiate those proceedings if you choose. So the question is, Miss Carter, do you want to proceed? Do you want to use your grandfather's money to make sure they face consequences? And I looked at Miss Agatha, looked at this woman who'd saved my life, who documented everything, who'd stood with me when nobody else would, and she gave me a small nod, just a tiny movement, just permission, just confirmation that this was right, was exactly what my grandfather had intended. And I looked back at Henderson, and I said, yes, proceed, file charges, hire investigators, use whatever resources are necessary. I want them prosecuted. I want them held accountable. I want them to face every possible consequence for what they tried to do, for what they did to me, for 18 years of abuse and 1 night of attempted murder. And I want it documented, want it public, want it clear that this is what happens when you try to kill your child for money, that this is the price, that this is the cost, that justice exists even for people who think they're above it, who think money and manipulation can protect them, who think family means they can abuse without consequences. And Henderson nodded, said, I'll have the papers drawn up by end of business today. We'll initiate contact with the district attorney's office. We'll hire a forensic accountant to document the financial abuse. We'll build a case so thorough, so complete, that plea deals become their only option, and those plea deals will cost them everything, will require full restitution, will involve prison time, will guarantee they never do this to anyone else. And hearing that, understanding that my grandfather had anticipated this, had built in protections, had created mechanisms for justice that would outlive him, it made me cry, made tears finally come. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude, of recognition that someone had loved me enough to protect me even after death, had valued me enough to spend money, time, energy ensuring I'd survive, ensuring I'd have resources, ensuring that the people who hurt me would face consequences. And that love, that delayed but real protection, it was more than my father had ever given me, more than Leslie had ever pretended to give me. It was actual love, actual care, actual belief that I was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth leaving resources to not just for survival but for victory, for justice, for the complete destruction of people who'd proven they didn't deserve the title of family, who'd earned only consequences, only prosecution, only the full weight of law and money turned against them in ways they couldn't fight, couldn't buy off, couldn't manipulate their way out of, because my grandfather, even dead, was still protecting me, was still fighting for me, was still making sure I'd win. And that winning was about to begin, was about to manifest, was about to become real in ways that would destroy them completely, permanently, finally. And I was ready, was prepared, was absolutely certain that this was right, was exactly what they deserved and so much more than they'd feared, because they'd underestimated not just me but my grandfather, had forgotten that he'd built wealth through intelligence, through planning, through understanding that people like Leslie existed, and protection required more than money, required strategy, required building consequences into trust documents, into legal structures, into systems that would activate automatically when his granddaughter needed them. And those systems were activating now, were launching now, were beginning the process of destruction that would take everything they had, everything they'd valued more than me, everything they'd been willing to kill for, and that taking, that removal, that complete devastating loss. It was coming, was inevitable, was going to teach them that some people prepare for betrayal, some grandparents love enough to protect from beyond the grave, and some trust funds aren't just money, they're weapons, they're justice, they're consequences waiting patiently for the right moment to deploy, and that moment had arrived, was here, was now, and they had no idea, had no warning, had no defense except lawyers they couldn't afford, and lies that didn't work anymore, and I was going to watch them fall, was going to witness their destruction, was going to understand that survival wasn't enough, wasn't sufficient, wasn't the end goal. Victory was the goal. Complete, absolute victory was what my grandfather had planned for, what he'd funded, what he'd guaranteed through careful legal work and smart financial planning, and I was going to claim it, was going to use it, was going to become not just survivor, but the person who destroyed them so completely. They'd spend years understanding exactly what it cost to underestimate me, to try to kill me, to value money over life. And that understanding, that education, that lesson, it started now, started with signatures, started with Henderson picking up his phone and calling attorneys, investigators, prosecutors, started with the machinery of justice grinding into motion, grinding toward them, grinding them into dust. And I was going to watch every moment, was going to witness every consequence, was going to make absolutely certain that when this was over, when justice was delivered, everyone would know, everyone would understand, everyone would learn that this is what happens, this is the cost, this is the price of trying to murder your child for inheritance, and that price was everything, was complete destruction, was exactly what they'd earned through their choices, their cruelty, their calculation that my life was worth less than $600,000, except they'd miscalculated, had forgotten that the money was protected, was weaponized, was designed specifically to destroy them if they tried exactly what they'd tried. And that design, that planning, that foresight, it was my grandfather's final gift, his ultimate protection, his way of making sure that even death wouldn't stop him from keeping me safe. And I was safe now, was protected now, was armed now with resources they couldn't match, couldn't fight, couldn't overcome, and the war they'd started was ending, was concluding, was finishing with their complete and total defeat, and I'd won, was winning, was about to experience victory so complete it would redefine everything I thought I knew about justice, about consequences, about what happened when love, real love, met betrayal and decided that destruction was the only appropriate response. I signed papers for what felt like hours, my hand cramping around the pen, Sydney Carter, Sydney Carter, Sydney Carter. Each signature a declaration, a claiming, a transformation from victim to owner, from powerless to powerful, from someone who'd been thrown away to someone who controlled resources, who had agency, who could fight back with tools that actually worked, with weapons that actually mattered, with money that translated directly into justice, into protection, into consequences for people who thought they were untouchable. And Henderson walked me through each document, explained the transfers, the accounts, the investments, the automatic payments that would ensure I had steady income, had resources for college, had foundation for building a life that didn't depend on anyone's permission, anyone's approval, anyone's decision that I was worth keeping. And he said, his voice careful but firm, I'm also setting up a separate account for legal expenses, 200,000 as specified in the codicil, and I'm authorizing payment to a firm that specializes in family law prosecution, in elder abuse, in financial crimes. They're the best in the state. They've never lost a case like this, and they're going to build something so comprehensive, so documented, so absolutely unbeatable that your stepmother and father won't have options, won't have defenses, won't have anything except plea bargains that cost them everything. And I want you to understand something, Sydney. Your grandfather knew. He knew what your stepmother was. He knew what your father had become. He watched it for years before he died, watched how they treated you, documented it, prepared for it, and this trust, these protections, this codicil, it wasn't just money, it was vengeance. It was his way of making sure that if they tried to hurt you, they'd destroy themselves, and they tried. They absolutely tried. And now the consequences he built, the trap he set, it's closing and there's no escape, no exit. No way out except through complete financial ruin and criminal prosecution, and that's exactly what they deserve, exactly what he intended, exactly what justice requires. Henderson made phone calls while I finished signing, called attorneys, called investigators, called people whose names I recognized from news articles about high-profile prosecutions, about white-collar crime, about family law cases that had ended with prison sentences, with asset seizures, with permanent consequences, and I listened to him describe the case, describe the evidence, describe the video of Tanner sealing the shed, describe the financial abuse, describe 18 years of documented mistreatment. And I heard the people on the other end respond, heard their interest, heard them asking questions, heard them agreeing to take the case, to prioritize it, to treat it as exactly what it was, which was attempted murder dressed up as family discipline, which was conspiracy to commit fraud, which was financial exploitation, which was every crime my grandfather had anticipated and built consequences for, and sitting there listening to justice being assembled, being constructed, being weaponized. Against people who'd thought they were safe, who'd thought family meant immunity, who'd calculated that my death would be investigated as accident rather than crime. I felt something I hadn't felt since my mother died. I felt protected, felt like someone was fighting for me, like someone had my back, like I wasn't alone against people who were bigger, stronger, more resourced, more experienced at manipulation. I had my grandfather fighting from beyond the grave, had Miss Agatha, who'd saved my life, had Henderson, who was treating this as personal mission rather than just professional duty, and I had money, real money, enough money to hire people who were better at fighting than my stepmother was at lying, and that advantage, that shift in power dynamics, it changed everything, changed how I thought about the future, changed how I felt about survival, changed me from someone running and hiding into someone who could stand and fight and win, and winning, actual complete victory that was coming, was inevitable, was guaranteed by resources and documentation, and the machinery of justice finally working the way it was supposed to work. There's one more thing, Henderson said, pulling out a folder I hadn't seen, this one marked with red tape, with official seals, with the weight of something serious, something final. Your grandfather's codicil includes provisions for what he called defensive asset seizure. It means that if your guardians attempted harm, if they triggered the protection clause, the trust has authority to freeze their access to any accounts, any credit, any financial resources that were originally sourced from family money, from your mother's inheritance, from household funds that should have been used for your benefit, and he pulled out bank statements, pulled out credit card records, pulled out mortgage documents, and he said the house they're living in, it was purchased with proceeds from your mother's life insurance, the car your father drives. It was bought with money from your college fund that was supposed to be protected. The credit cards they've been using, they're backed by equity in the house, which means they're backed by your money, by resources that should have been yours, that were supposed to support you, that they diverted, that they stole, and under the terms of the trust, under the protections your grandfather built in, I have authority as of this moment to freeze all of it, to cancel the credit cards, to call the mortgage, to repossess the car, to strip them of access to every resource they've been using, every comfort they've been enjoying, every piece of the life they built on stolen money, on diverted assets, on funds that belong to you. And the question is, Miss Carter, do you want me to proceed? Do you want me to leave them with nothing while the prosecution builds? Or do you want to wait? Want to give them time to prepare, time to hide assets, time to borrow more money, time to build defenses? And I looked at him, understood what he was really asking, understood that this was the choice between mercy and justice, between giving them chance to fight back or destroying them completely, immediately, permanently. And I thought about my mother, about the life insurance that was supposed to ensure I'd be okay, that was supposed to be her final gift, her way of taking care of me after death. And they'd stolen it, had used it, had built their comfort on her sacrifice. And I thought about my grandfather, about the trust he'd built to protect me, about the careful planning, the legal structures, the provisions he'd included because he'd known, had understood, had predicted exactly this scenario. And I thought about standing on that porch at 11:03 p.m., thought about 30 below cold, thought about my father's back turning, thought about Leslie's relief, thought about Tanner laughing while sealing a shed that was supposed to be my tomb, and I said, my voice steady, my decision absolute, my certainty complete, proceed, freeze everything, cancel everything, take everything, leave them with nothing, let them feel what I felt. Let them understand what it's like to have safety stripped away, to have comfort removed, to have the ground disappear beneath your feet. They tried to kill me for money. Now let them lose everything for trying. Let the punishment fit the crime. Let justice be proportional to betrayal. And I don't want mercy. Don't want compromise. Don't want anything except their complete and total destruction. Financial, legal, social. Everything. Because that's what they earned. That's what they deserve. That's what my grandfather built this trust to deliver, and I want it delivered now, immediately, completely, without warning, without chance for preparation. The way they gave me no warning, no chance, no preparation for being thrown into a blizzard. Let them experience the same shock, the same terror, the same understanding that everything they thought was solid is actually gone, is taken, is removed by forces they can't fight, can't negotiate with, can't manipulate. And Henderson nodded. Said, I was hoping you'd say that, and he picked up his phone, started making calls, started executing orders, started the process of systematic destruction, and I watched, I listened, I heard him cancel credit cards, heard him call mortgages, heard him freeze accounts, heard him strip away every piece of financial security they had, every buffer, every safety net, every resource, and it happened fast, happened efficiently, happened with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly how to dismantle a life, how to remove supports, how to leave people standing on nothing, and within 30 minutes, within half an hour, my father and Leslie went from living in a paid-off house with credit cards and car payments and all the trappings of middle-class stability to having nothing, having access to nothing, having credit denied, having accounts frozen, having every attempt to withdraw money, to buy anything, to use any resource met with declined, with insufficient funds, with account closed, and that removal, that sudden catastrophic loss, it was beautiful, was justice, was exactly proportional to what they tried to do to me, and I felt no guilt, felt no remorse, felt only the cold satisfaction of watching consequences arrive, watching people who'd thought they were safe discover they were actually standing on ground that could disappear, that had disappeared, that was gone, and their falling, their panic, their desperate attempts to understand what was happening, that was just beginning, was just the first wave, was just the introduction to consequences that would build, would intensify, would continue until they understood fully, completely, permanently what it cost to try to murder your child for inheritance, what it meant to value money over life, what happened when calculated cruelty met calculated justice, and discovered that justice, properly funded, properly planned, properly executed, was stronger, was more devastating, was capable of destruction they couldn't imagine, couldn't prepare for, couldn't survive. 2 hours after we left the bank, my phone buzzed. The burner phone Miss Agatha had gotten me, and it was an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up, made me answer, and my father's voice came through, cracked, desperate, confused. Sydney, he said, what did you do? What's happening? The credit cards are declined. The bank says the mortgage is in default. They're saying we have to vacate in 30 days. Leslie is, he paused, she's screaming. She's saying you did this. She's saying you stole everything. What did you do? And I felt nothing hearing his confusion, felt no sympathy, no guilt, no desire to explain, to justify, to make him understand. I just said I accessed my trust fund. Dad, the money my grandfather left me, the money that was mine, the money you've been planning to steal by killing me. And now that money is being used exactly as my grandfather intended, to protect me from you, to punish you for what you tried to do, to make absolutely certain you face every possible consequence. And the house, the car, the credit cards, all of that was bought with my mother's life insurance, with money that should have been used to raise me, to protect me, to ensure I'd be okay. And you stole it, you diverted it, you used it to build comfort for yourself and your new family while I lived in a home where I wasn't wanted, where I wasn't safe, where I was treated like burden rather than daughter. And now that money is gone, is frozen, is being seized, and you're going to feel what I've felt my entire life, which is having nothing, having no security, having no safety net, except you chose this, you earned this, you created this through your choices, through your decision to let Leslie kick me out, through your choice to turn your back while I stood in 30 below cold, through your complicity in attempted murder. And those choices have prices, have costs, have consequences, and you're about to pay them all. And I hung up. Didn't wait for response, didn't want to hear excuses, didn't care about his confusion or his fear or his desperate attempts to understand what was happening, because understanding didn't matter, mercy didn't matter, explanation didn't matter. Only consequences mattered, only justice mattered, only making absolutely certain that what they'd done, what they'd tried to do, what they'd planned to do, would cost them everything, would destroy them completely, would leave Them with nothing except years to think about what they'd lost, what they'd thrown away, what they'd valued more than their daughter's life. And those years, that time, that long, slow understanding, that was part of the punishment, was part of the justice, was part of what my grandfather had planned when he built protections that weren't just defensive but offensive, that didn't just shield me but destroyed them, and that destruction was just beginning, was just starting, was just the first phase of consequences that would build, would intensify, would continue until the prosecutors Henderson had hired finished building their case, until charges were filed, until arrests were made, until trials concluded with convictions, with sentences, with prison time, with permanent records, with social consequences that would follow them forever, that would make sure everyone knew, everyone understood, everyone learned that this is what happens, this is the cost, this is the price of valuing money over children, of treating family as transaction, of calculating that murder is acceptable if the math works out, except the math didn't work out, hadn't worked out, had been designed by someone smarter than them, by someone who'd anticipated their moves, who'd built traps they couldn't see, couldn't avoid, couldn't escape, and they'd walked right into those traps, had triggered every consequence, had activated every protection, and now they were caught, were trapped, were facing destruction they'd brought on themselves through their own cruelty, their own greed, their own catastrophic miscalculation that I was weak, was disposable, was someone who'd die quietly without fighting back, and they'd been wrong, been completely wrong, been catastrophically wrong, and that wrongness, that error, that misjudgment, it was costing them everything, and I was going to watch, was going to witness, was going to make absolutely certain that every consequence landed, every punishment stuck, every piece of justice was delivered exactly as my grandfather had planned, exactly as they deserved, exactly as the law allowed when properly funded, properly directed, properly unleashed on people who'd committed crimes they thought would go unpunished, who'd calculated that family meant immunity, who'd believed that my death would be investigated as accident rather than murder, except investigations cost money, except justice costs money, except I had money now, had resources, had $600,000 minus what I needed to survive plus $200,000 specifically earmarked for destroying them, and that destruction was happening, was real, was demonstrating that sometimes if you're patient enough, if you document everything, if you survive long enough to access resources, the people who tried to kill you face consequences, real consequences, permanent consequences. And those consequences were beautiful, were just, were exactly what the world needed more of. And I was grateful, was thankful, was understanding for the first time that my grandfather's love hadn't died with him, had survived, had grown, had become this protection, this justice, this systematic dismantling of people who'd hurt his granddaughter, and that dismantling was the most powerful expression of love I'd ever experienced, more powerful than words, more powerful than presence, more powerful than anything except maybe Miss Agatha grabbing my wrist in 30 below cold and saying, "Don't go to that shed," that intervention that had saved my life, that had made all of this possible, that had given me the chance to fight back, to win, to understand that survival wasn't enough. Victory was possible, was achievable, was waiting for people who refused to die quietly, who refused to accept being disposed of, who refused to let attempted murder go unpunished. And I was one of those people, was exactly that person, and they were about to learn it completely, were about to understand it fully, were about to spend years regretting that they'd ever tried to kill me. 1 week later the charges were filed, formal criminal charges, attempted murder, conspiracy, financial exploitation, fraud, a list so long the prosecutor told me it would take 20 minutes just to read them all in court, and Tanner was arrested first, picked up at school, handcuffs in front of his friends, in front of teachers, in front of everyone who'd thought he was normal, was fine, was just a regular kid. And the news spread fast, spread through social media, spread through the community, spread until everyone knew, until the story was public, until my family's attempt to murder me for inheritance was no longer secret, was no longer hidden, was exposed in police reports and news articles and court filings that anyone could read, could see, could understand, and Leslie tried to control the narrative, tried to post on Facebook about how I was troubled, was lying, was making false accusations. But Henderson's attorneys had anticipated that, had prepared for that, had filed defamation suits before she even started typing, had sent cease and desist letters that made it clear every word she posted was evidence, was ammunition, was building the case against her, and she stopped, went silent, disappeared from social media, from public view, from anywhere she might be seen, might be judged, might face consequences of opinion even before legal consequences. Arrived, and my father, Scott, he tried calling, tried texting, tried showing up at places he thought I might be, but I'd moved, had used trust money to get an apartment, a small studio with big windows and a lock that was mine, that nobody else had keys to, that nobody could use to trap me, to control me, to decide whether I deserved warmth, deserved shelter, deserved to live, and I decorated it simply, minimally, just what I needed, just enough to be comfortable, and Miss Agatha helped, came over with cleaning supplies, with advice about furniture placement, with the accumulated wisdom of someone who'd lost everything and knew exactly what mattered, what was necessary, what was worth investing in, and she didn't stay on the streets anymore. I'd offered her money, offered her an apartment, offered her everything she needed, but she'd refused, had said I have my reasons for being where I am, have my own story, my own choices, my own path, but I appreciate the offer, appreciate you thinking of me, appreciate that you survived, that you're building something, that you're becoming someone who can fight back, and that's all I wanted, all I hoped for, all I worked for when I mounted that camera, when I grabbed your wrist, when I saved your life, because the world needs people who survive, who fight back, who refuse to let cruelty win, and you're one of those people, Sydney, you're exactly that person, and I'm proud of you, proud of what you're becoming, proud that I was part of your story, and hearing that, understanding that this woman who lived on streets, who had nothing by most measures, was proud of me, was invested in my survival, was part of my story in ways that mattered more than blood, more than DNA, more than any family connection. It made me understand that family wasn't biology, wasn't obligation, wasn't something you were born into, it was something you chose, something you built, something you created through actions rather than words, through presence rather than promises, through intervention when intervention was dangerous, through documentation when documentation was lonely work, through believing someone was worth saving when everyone else had decided they were disposable. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks after the arrest, and I had to testify, had to face them, had to sit in a witness box while my father and Leslie and Tanner sat at the defendant's table with their court-appointed attorneys, because they couldn't afford private lawyers anymore, couldn't afford anything anymore. We're living in a rental apartment that the court had helped arrange. We're surviving on public assistance, on food stamps, on the social safety net they'd probably spent years complaining about, years saying was too generous, years judging people who used it, and now they were those people, were dependent on systems they'd scorned, were learning what it felt like to have nothing, to need help, to be judged for needing help, and I felt no sympathy, felt no guilt, felt only the satisfaction of watching karma arrive, watching consequences land, watching people who'd thought they were above struggle discover they were actually deeply, desperately struggling, and that struggle was just beginning, was just the preview, was just the introduction to what came next, which was trial, which was conviction, which was sentencing, which was prison, real prison, federal prison, because some of the charges involved wire fraud, involved using phones and internet to plan crimes, involved crossing state lines in ways that made it federal jurisdiction, and federal charges meant federal prison, meant years, meant serious time in facilities far from home, in places where visits were difficult, where comfort was impossible, where every day was a reminder of what they'd lost, what they'd chosen, what they'd valued more than family, more than life, more than basic human decency, and those reminders, those daily confrontations with consequences, that was justice, was appropriate, was exactly what they deserved, and I was going to make sure they served every day, every hour, every minute of whatever sentences they received, was going to oppose every parole hearing, every clemency request, every attempt to reduce time or reduce consequences or suggest that somehow they'd learned, they'd changed, they'd become people who deserved second chances, because some crimes don't deserve second chances, some betrayals are too complete, some calculations of murder are too cold, and what they'd done, what they'd planned, what they'd almost accomplished that was permanent, was unforgivable, was worthy of permanent consequences, and I was going to ensure those consequences lasted, were enforced, were maintained for as long as the law allowed, for as long as justice required, for as long as it took for them to fully, completely, permanently understand what it cost to try to kill your daughter for money. I testified for 2 hours, walked through everything, the eviction, the cold, Miss Agatha's warning, the video of Tanner sealing the shed, the trust fund, the discovery of financial abuse, the systematic theft of my mother's life insurance, the credit card fraud, the mortgage fraud, everything, and I watched their faces while I testified. Watched Tanner look down, look away, look anywhere except at me, watched Leslie maintain her mask, maintain her composure, maintain her performance of being wrongly accused, and watched my father, watched Scott, watched him cry, watched tears run down his face like he was the victim, like he was the one who'd suffered, like his pain mattered more than my attempted murder, and I felt nothing, felt no pity, felt no softness, felt only disgust that even now, even facing criminal charges, even sitting in a courtroom while his daughter described being thrown into a blizzard, he was making it about himself, was performing grief, was trying to elicit sympathy, was calculating that maybe if he cried enough, if he looked sorry enough, someone would believe he was victim rather than perpetrator, would believe he'd been controlled rather than complicit, would believe he deserved mercy, deserved understanding, deserved something other than the consequences he'd earned, and I made absolutely certain that my testimony destroyed that possibility, destroyed that narrative, made clear that he'd made choices, active choices, deliberate choices, had calculated costs, had turned his back, had chosen comfort over his daughter's life, and those choices were his, were made by him, were not forced, were not coerced, were not the actions of someone being controlled, but the actions of someone who'd weighed options and chosen wrong, chosen evil, chosen money and peace over life and love, and that choosing was his, was permanent, was worthy of punishment, and I wanted the court to understand that. Wanted the judge to see clearly that mercy for him was injustice for me, was rewarding calculation, was telling everyone that fathers could watch daughters die and face no consequences if they cried convincingly enough, if they performed remorse effectively enough, if they made themselves look like victims rather than like the willing participants they actually were, and I refused, absolutely refused, to let that narrative win, to let that performance work, to let tears substitute for accountability, and my testimony made that clear, made that impossible, made sure that when the judge made decisions, when sentences were determined, when justice was delivered, it would be based on actions rather than tears, on choices rather than excuses, on reality rather than performance, and reality was damning, was clear, was absolutely unambiguous that they'd tried to kill me, had almost succeeded, had been stopped only by intervention they couldn't have predicted, couldn't have planned for, couldn't have prevented, and that failure, that survival, that was what had triggered everything else, had activated protections, had delivered consequences, had brought us to this courtroom where justice was finally being delivered. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence for trial, ruled that bail would remain high, ruled that Tanner would stay in juvenile detention until trial, ruled that Leslie and my father would remain under house arrest with ankle monitors, with restrictions on movement, with inability to leave the county, to flee, to escape consequences that were coming, and the trial date was set for 3 months out. 3 months of them sitting in their rental apartment. 3 months of them understanding what they'd lost. 3 months of them watching television and seeing my story, seeing news coverage, seeing public opinion turn against them, seeing social media posts about what they'd done, seeing judgment from strangers, from community members, from people who'd known them, who'd thought they were normal, were decent, were people worthy of respect, and now knew differently, knew truth, knew that behind the performance had been calculation, had been cruelty, had been willingness to commit murder for inheritance, and that knowing that public judgment, that social consequence, it was part of the punishment, was part of justice, was making sure that even before legal consequences were finalized, they were experiencing the cost of what they'd done, the price of being exposed, the weight of everyone knowing, everyone seeing, everyone understanding exactly what kind of people they were, and I watched that happen, watched their social destruction, watched their isolation, watched them lose friends, lose community, lose everything except each other, and even that was fracturing, was breaking because Leslie blamed my father, blamed his weakness, blamed his inability to control me, and my father blamed Leslie, blamed her demands, blamed her influence, and they were turning on each other, were destroying their own marriage, were discovering that relationships built on shared cruelty, on mutual exploitation, on agreement that money mattered more than life. Those relationships couldn't survive pressure, couldn't survive consequences, couldn't survive the reality that their plan had failed. Their victim had survived, their future was prison, and there was no escape, no exit, no way out except through complete and total loss of everything they'd valued, everything they'd chosen over me, everything they'd thought was worth having. And that loss, that destruction, that systematic dismantling of their life, it was beautiful, was just, was exactly what my grandfather had planned, what he'd funded, what he'd made possible through careful legal work, through trust documents, through protections that outlived him, that continued his love, that delivered his vengeance on people who'd hurt his granddaughter. And I was grateful, was thankful, was understanding more fully every day that I'd been loved, had been valued, had been worth protecting even when I couldn't protect myself, even when I didn't know protection existed, even when I thought I was alone. I hadn't been alone. I'd had my grandfather watching from beyond death. I'd had Miss Agatha watching from the streets. I'd had justice waiting to be activated, waiting to be deployed, waiting for the right moment to destroy people who'd thought they were untouchable. And that moment had come, had arrived, had delivered everything it promised, and more was coming, more consequences, more justice, more complete and absolute destruction of people who'd earned it, who deserved it, who'd chosen it through their actions, through their cruelty, through their calculation that my life was worth less than $600,000, except they'd miscalculated, had forgotten that money could be used for protection as well as for theft, for justice as well as for comfort, for destruction as well as for building, and my money, my grandfather's money, my inheritance, it was being used exactly right, was being deployed exactly as intended, was destroying them completely, permanently, finally, and I was going to watch every moment, was going to witness every consequence, was going to make absolutely certain that when this was over, when justice was complete, when they were in prison serving years for what they'd done, everyone would know, everyone would understand, everyone would learn that this is what happens when you try to murder your child for inheritance. This is the cost. This is the price. This is the permanent, irreversible consequence of valuing money over life. And that lesson, that example, that demonstration, it mattered not just for me, not just for my justice, but for every other child approaching 18, approaching inheritance, approaching whatever age triggered access to money someone else wanted. Because now there was example, was precedent, was public record showing that murder for inheritance had consequences, real consequences, permanent consequences. And those consequences could be funded, could be delivered, could be made inevitable by proper planning, by loving grandparents, by trust documents, by legal structures that protected long after death. And other families would see this, would learn from this, would understand that killing children for money was neither safe nor profitable, was instead incredibly dangerous, incredibly expensive, incredibly likely to destroy not just the victim but the perpetrators. And that understanding, that social learning, that cultural shift, it was worth everything, worth every difficult moment, worth every hard choice, worth every tear, because I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, wasn't just seeking personal justice. I was setting precedent, was establishing standard, was demonstrating that survival was possible, that fighting back was possible, that victory was possible even when you started with nothing, even when family tried to kill you, even when the system seemed too slow, too complicated, too expensive, because systems could be navigated, complications could be managed. Expenses could be covered if you had resources, if you had documentation, if you had people like Miss Agatha who cared enough to intervene, who documented enough to make cases prosecutable, who believed enough in justice to risk themselves. And I had all of that, had survived because of all of that, had won because of all of that. And now I was going to make sure everyone knew, everyone saw, everyone understood that this victory was possible, was replicable, was available to anyone who documented everything, who survived long enough, who refused to die quietly, who fought back with every tool available. And sometimes those tools included money, included trust funds, included grandfathers who loved enough to plan beyond death. And those tools, properly used, properly deployed, properly directed, they could destroy evil, could deliver justice, could make sure that attempted murder, that family betrayal, that calculated cruelty had costs, real costs, permanent costs. And watching those costs land, watching my family experience them, watching justice arrive exactly as planned, exactly as deserved, exactly as my grandfather had intended, it was the most satisfying. experience of my life was proof that love existed, that protection was real, that justice was possible, and I was living it, was witnessing it, was part of it, and I wanted everyone watching to know, to understand, to believe that if you're in similar situation, if your family is calculating your worth, if inheritance is making you a target, you can survive, you can fight back, you can win, and there are people who will help, will document, will intervene, and there are systems that work if you know how to use them. And there are consequences for people who try to kill family members for money, real consequences, permanent consequences. And if you're watching this, if you've stayed through this entire story, if you've seen how it ends, then I want you to watch the next story too. I want you to see another example of family betrayal, another journey from victim to victor, another demonstration that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice that arrives exactly when it should, exactly when you're ready for it. Exactly when you have resources to make it permanent. And that justice, that beautiful, terrible, necessary justice, it's real, it's possible, it's what happened to me, it's what I made happen to them, and it's what can happen for you too if you're brave enough, patient enough, smart enough to document everything, to survive everything, to fight back with everything, and I'm proof. I'm example, I'm demonstration that the girl they threw away, the daughter they tried to murder, the child they valued less than money, I survived, I fought back, I won, and they lost everything, everything they valued, everything they chose over me, and that loss, that justice, that consequence, it's permanent, it's complete, it's exactly what they deserved, and watching it happen has been the most powerful experience of my life, and I want you to watch, to see, to understand, to know that this ending is possible, that justice is real, that love from beyond the grave can protect, can avenge, can deliver exactly what's needed when it's needed most. And I'm grateful, I'm thankful, I'm alive, I'm free, I'm safe, and they're not. They're trapped, they're facing years in prison. They're experiencing exactly what they tried to make me experience, except permanent, except legal, except deserved, and that's justice. That's love. That's what happens when you try to kill someone who was protected all along, who was loved all along, who was worth more than you ever understood, and they learned that too late, learned it expensively, learned it permanently, and now everyone else can learn from their mistake, can see their consequences, can understand that family betrayal has prices, attempted murder has costs, and those prices and costs are everything, are complete destruction, are exactly what happened to them, exactly what they earned, exactly what justice requires.